Trick or treat, where's the meat? Give us haute cuisine to eat. If you don't, just beware, everything's edible, except your hair. And so this season, have a ball. Invite your family, friends, and all. But if they're crass, if they're crude, just remember. Well, it's that special spooky time of year again, Halloween. Despite the fact that it never has a specific Halloween-themed episode, there's definitely plenty of spooks and scares to be had on Hannibal. Though it wouldn't fall under what I would call classic horror or slasher TV, there's still plenty of gore to go around. In fact, the season 2 finale is still considered the bloodiest thing to be aired on regular cable television. Both Hannibal the show and the movies are considered more psychological thrillers than outright horror, and are, much like the titular character, of a higher class in sophistication. And the show takes this to another level with its incredibly artistic camera work and poetic dialogue, so the horror and gore are elevated along with it. Much like how a recipe rewards you in the end with a brief yet delicious outcome, this show rewards you with incredible fights, action, and blood for working through its artsy and sometimes complicated through-plot, and much like a complicated recipe, is very much worth the effort in the end. Hannibal as a horror character is particularly terrifying because he doesn't have to wear a human flesh mask or brandish some bloody knives to be scary, although he has done both of those. Hannibal lives right in the open, looks just like everyone else, in fact is a high-ranking member of society, and he's so incredibly charming that the sighted world would never suspect he's capable of such crimes. Hannibal gets in your head, but not in any kind of immediately obvious way. One minute you're chatting about the weather, and the next you've murdered Zachary Quinto by fisting his trachea, and Hannibal's standing over you saying, "What have you done?"
You butchered him.
The fear with Hannibal is not that he's gonna cut off your arm and eat it. The fear is you're gonna be okay with it, and then you're gonna try it, and then you're gonna like it. So in my book, Dr. Hannibal Lecter takes the cake as the spookiest and the best dressed of the horror movie villains. However, I have something far more terrifying coming to town. Texans. My aunt and 2 cousins are coming up from Texas for a visit, and it's been a very long time since I've seen them, but it's been even longer since I've seen all of them together, so I'm pretty excited for them to visit. Plus, one of my cousins is bringing her boyfriend, and my brother just announced that he and his wife are pregnant, so there's a lot to celebrate. So while they're here, I thought I'd subject them to one of my dinner parties. However, quite off-theme, it seems that everything I picked for this dinner is vegetarian. Is that even allowed? Well, it's just as well, meat's pretty freaking expensive. So let's get to it. The main course for this party is going to be the pumpkin lasagna al dentures. Cute. Which we'll be getting some fresh pumpkins from a local pumpkin patch for. And for a snack, I'll be making the tomato brain barquettes with the last tomatoes of the season from our garden. And for a communal dessert, we'll be making some classic red candy apples served a la Red Dragon. And for a hangout night with just me and the cousins, I'll be making the snail pesto buns to munch on. And the Miriam Birium cocktails to wash them down. This is usually the part where I relate the recipes to the episodes that they're in, but none of these recipes are actually featured in the show. So, to the pumpkin patch! So first things first, we're going to need to cook our pumpkins, and here we have some pie pumpkins, which are smaller pumpkins used for cooking and baking. Begin by cutting off the tops and bottoms, and then in half. And then using a spoon, scrape out all the proverbial guts and the seeds until you have some nice clean pumpkin halves. And make sure to save the seeds for a bonus recipe we're going to do later. Now we need to steam our pumpkin pieces. Into a large pot, begin with some water and place a steamer basket at the bottom and bring to a boil. Then place your pumpkin pieces inside and cover in steam for about 15 minutes. You can check its doneness by testing it with a fork, and when it is nice and tender, it's ready to go. Place those in a bowl and set to the side to cool before handling. While those are cooling, we'll begin by making the shells for our tomato barquettes. So we'll take some thawed puff pastry and fold it out and cut out 2-inch circles using a biscuit cutter, or in my case, the lid to a Parmesan shaker, but you work with what you got. Then we'll gently pull them apart, and make sure to save the scraps as you can roll them out for a few more circles. Then with a 1-inch biscuit cutter, or in my case a plastic bottle cap, press an indent into the middle of the dough circle, being careful not to press all the way through. Then we'll place those on a parchment-lined baking sheet, and using a fork, we'll poke some holes in the inner circle. Then just a quick brush of melted butter, and then place those in the oven at 400 degrees for 10 to 12 minutes until the circles have puffed up and are golden brown. Let them sit aside and cool completely before handling. Then using your bottle cap again, press into the pastry and break the seal you made before then using a toothpick to lift out the inner circle and then scrape out any inner layers you can to make a nice open shell. Then place your shells on some plates and cover with plastic wrap and set them aside until you're ready to fill. Next, we'll make the olive tapenade that goes inside them, so begin with some Kalamata olives, a couple cloves of garlic, a small jar of capers, a small bit of anchovy paste, a little lemon juice, some olive oil, some salt and fresh ground pepper, and finally, some fresh parsley and chives. Then pulse a few times in the food processor until nicely minced like you see here. And we'll set that aside in the refrigerator until later. To begin our candy apples, we'll start by preparing a baking sheet and prepare a piece of parchment paper on top of it and brush it with some butter. To begin our syrup, start with 4 cups of sugar, 2 cups of water, and 1 cup of light corn syrup. Then boil over medium heat and continue to stir gently and using a candy thermometer to cook until the syrup reaches 295 degrees. Then pull off of the heat and allow it to cool slightly. Then we'll add our red food coloring and stir it in, and it'll do this cool, witchy, bubbly thing. Continue to stir until smooth and diabolical looking. For the skewers, I managed to find these chopsticks that had some cool red metallic Chinese characters on them, but they were much too long, so we'll measure and cut them and then sharpen them to a point and sand smooth. And there we have our decorative skewers. Start by removing the stems from the apples with some pliers, getting in as deep as you can. Then insert your skewers at the top and tap them slightly with a hammer to wedge them in. Then making sure to use gloves because this syrup is hot. Dip your apples in the syrup, tilting the pan to make sure they are completely coated. Then let the excess drip off for a moment and ask your magic mirror who the fairest of them all is, and gently set them on your prepared greased parchment paper. And there we have our pretty little candy apples. Set them aside and allow them to harden completely. So now for our bonus pumpkin seed recipe. Separate the seeds from the guts, then rinse your seeds and pick out as much pumpkin as you can. Then spread them out on some paper towels in a nice even layer, and then press more paper towels on top to dry them as much as you can. Then we'll scoop up our seeds and put them into a quart-sized Ziploc bag. You only want the exact size you need. And we'll add to the bag some crushed garlic cloves and a tablespoon or so of red pepper flakes, and plenty of soy sauce for it to swim in completely. Then seal that up and mix it all around and let it marinate for several hours or overnight. Then we'll drain out any remaining soy sauce through a wire strainer and then spread them out evenly among some parchment paper covered cookie sheets. Making sure to spread them out in a single layer as they need to dry out completely. Now they are ready for the oven. Place both pans in the oven and keep your oven at just about 200 degrees for several hours so that they completely dry out. After an hour or so, you'll need to take your pans out of the oven and give the seeds a little toss and return them to the oven, switching the racks that they were on. Now our pumpkin should be cooled, and if all goes well, the skin should peel off incredibly easy like this. Then we'll go ahead and cut them up into small cubes. And then measure out as much pumpkin as you'll need. I'll be doubling the recipe and be making 2 pans of lasagna, so I'll need 8 cups total. To make the pumpkin filling for the lasagna, begin with a stick of melted butter and add to that 2 diced onions. Stir to coat with the butter, then add a few sprigs of fresh sage and fold those in and continue to cook the onions until nice and translucent. Then we'll carefully remove our sprigs of sage and add to it our cooked pumpkin, stirring it all together and seasoning with some kosher salt and fresh ground pepper. And you may need to use a potato masher for any larger chunks still left. To that, add a cup of cream and stir until completely combined and still slightly lumpy. Next, for the cheese and spinach layer, we'll start by washing some spinach and using the method we've used before. Place in a Ziploc bag, leaving about an inch to vent, then microwaving in small increments until the spinach is lightly wilted. Then drain and press out as much water as possible. Then place onto a cutting board and chop up your spinach and set that aside. Then in another bowl, we'll start with 9 ounces of goat cheese, 16 ounces of ricotta cheese, and I added an ounce of cream cheese because the ricotta comes in 15-ounce containers for some reason. Then combine that all together with a potato masher. I never get tired of that. Then we'll fold in our chopped spinach and season lightly with some salt and pepper, and then some crushed garlic cloves. And finally, we'll fold in some beaten eggs. Give that a good mix until completely combined. Now we'll begin by making our pasta sheets, so begin with a pot of boiling lightly salted water and add your lasagna sheets and cook them until al dente. Then pull them out and give them a quick dry dab on some paper towels and layer them into an oiled lasagna pan. Now we're finally ready to begin assembling. Begin with a layer of cooked pasta sheets, then a layer of my homemade tomato sauce from last season's tomatoes, then a layer of shredded fontina and mozzarella cheeses, another layer of pasta sheets, then a nice thick layer of our pumpkin filling, another layer of pasta sheets, and then our middle layer of cheesy spinach. Then we will simply repeat the layers in reverse order. Pasta, pumpkin, pasta, tomato sauce, more shredded cheese, and a sprinkle of Parmesan. Loosely tent them with foil, and they are ready for the oven. Now that we're at the party, we'll begin by preparing our tomato barquettes. So take some firm Roma tomatoes and cut them in half lengthwise. Then we'll take our shells and fill the bottoms with a small scoop of our tapenade and then a scoop of tomato seeds. And there we have it. Then, so the remaining tomato doesn't go to waste, we're going to make some basic bruschetta. So dice your tomatoes and add some fresh basil, a drizzle of olive oil, salt and pepper, and then give that a good toss. Then, after making some toasted bread, we have yet another delicious appetizer. As per usual, my grandmother made a delicious harvest salad with pears, candied pecans, and crumbled blue cheese. Your lasagna should bake at 325 degrees for 40 minutes. Then remove the foil and bake for another 20 minutes to let the cheese brown. And now at last, we are ready for dinner. Next up is the snail pesto buns, which will start with some pre-made pizza dough, but you could use homemade if you like, but you'll need to let it rise before baking. Roll out your dough and flatten and press them out to be nice, even, flattened rectangles. Then on one, we're going to spread a thin layer of pesto, and on the other, spread a thin layer of tomato paste. Then we'll also season that with some salt and pepper. Then sprinkle both with a healthy dose of Parmesan cheese. Then roll them up and form them into nice even logs, and then cut them into half-inch thick slices to make these fun-looking spirals. Then oil a baking sheet and arrange your slices nice and evenly. Then bake those for about 10 minutes at 350 degrees until goldeny brown. For our beer cocktails, we'll start with a tall Pilsner glass of ice. Then we'll start with an ounce of Amaro, which is a bitter, earthy liqueur. Then an ounce and a half of sweet vermouth, and a half ounce of grapefruit juice, and finally topped off with a light Italian lager, such as Peotone. Then give that a good stir, and add a half a grapefruit slice to garnish. And there we have it. Well, for those of you keeping score at home, that's another 5 recipes down for a total of 35 recipes completed, leaving us still 102 to go. So the pumpkin lasagna was freaking incredible. Out of the park. I was very wary on how the tomato sauce was going to blend together with the squash flavors of the pumpkin, but it all melded together perfectly and was a huge hit with everybody. The appetizers I made were pretty well received, and the combination of the tapenade and the tomato jelly was the epitome of freshness. And I imagine you could fill those kinds of shells with just about anything to match any kind of flavor for any kind of theme. The candy apples were alright. I can't say for certain I cooked the sugar quite perfectly, so they might have been harder than would be desired, but they were still an interesting experience and a fun decorative creation. And were actually quite tasty if one wanted to take the effort to eat it. The snail pesto buns were certainly tasty and incredibly easy to make. However, the surprising success of this menu was the beer cocktail. It was a delightful combination of flavors, savory, bitter, sweet, and so incredibly refreshing. I continued to make them for everybody for the next few days until we finally ran out of the beers. Well, I had an amazing time with my family, and it was certainly amazing to have everybody together for the first time in a long, long time. And it was really nice to get to cook for my family, which I've never done for so many of them all at once. So I'd like to take this moment to thank all of my friends and family for their continued support in this little culinary endeavor of mine, both as guinea pigs for these incredibly, sometimes strange recipes, and for their financial support at times. I really appreciate you all so very much. If you'd also like to support Hannibal and I by becoming a patron, you can send your support through PayPal, Cashapp, or Zelle, and you can find the information for those in the description below. That is it for this episode of Hannibal and I. I'm cmarcukaitis. Hope everybody had a safe and spooky Halloween. Remember always to stay courteous, and I will see you in the kitchen next time.